I almost threw that old coat away the day after my mother died. It had been hanging in the same closet for over 30 years, faded, heavy, and carrying the unmistakable scent of cedar wood and winter. Every relative who came to help clean the house said the same thing. It's ruined. Nobody will ever wear that again. Just donate it. But my mother's last words before she closed her eyes echoed inside my mind more loudly than anyone else's opinion. Promise me you'll never throw away that coat. I thought it was grief talking. Maybe she had simply become attached to something that reminded her of my father. Maybe old age had made sentimental things seem more important than they really were. So I kept my promise. Year after year, the coat remained exactly where she had left it. I moved houses twice. I got married. I became a mother, then a grandmother. Furniture came and went. Clothes were donated every season. But never that coat. I never wore it. I never looked inside it. And strangely, I never questioned why. Until one freezing winter morning, nearly 30 years later, I reached into one of its pockets for the very first time. What I found inside didn't just explain my mother's final request. It changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my father, and the woman who had spent her entire life protecting a secret she was terrified someone else would discover. My name is Margaret, and I was 68 years old when I finally understood why one old winter coat had become the most valuable thing my mother ever left behind. Not because it was expensive. Not because it belonged to anyone famous. In fact, anyone looking at it would have assumed it was destined for the trash years ago. The sleeves had been patched twice. The lining was worn thin in places. One button had been replaced with another that didn't even match. It was the kind of coat people donate without thinking twice. Yet for more than 3 decades, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. When my mother was alive, she was never a woman who asked for much. She believed promises should only be made when they truly mattered. If she asked you for something, she had already spent weeks deciding whether it was important enough to say aloud. That was simply who she was. Quiet, patient, careful with every word. She had survived years that taught people not to waste anything. Every dress was repaired instead of replaced. Every glass jar found another purpose. Every letter was tied neatly with ribbon and placed inside old wooden boxes instead of being thrown away. Looking back now, I realized she wasn't simply saving objects. She was preserving memories that nobody else knew existed. Growing up, I never questioned any of it. Children accept their parent habits as normal. Only much later do they begin noticing the strange little routines that make no sense. Like how my mother refused to let anyone touch that coat. Every winter, she would remove it from the closet, brush away invisible dust, inspect every seam, smile to herself, and quietly hang it back again. She never wore it. Not once. If someone asked why she kept it, she would simply answer, "Some things aren't meant to be understood until the right time." I always assumed it was another one of her mysterious sayings. She had dozens of them. Most sounded like old-fashioned wisdom from another generation. I smiled politely and never asked another question. Then life happened. I married young. My husband and I raised 2 wonderful children while struggling to pay bills like everyone else. We moved from one small house to another, changed jobs more times than I can remember, buried loved ones, welcomed grandchildren, and watched decades disappear faster than either of us expected. During all those years, my mother grew older, but somehow she remained the strongest person in the family. Even after my father passed away, she never complained. She simply continued living quietly, tending her small garden, baking bread every Sunday, writing birthday cards by hand, and pretending everything was perfectly ordinary. Only now do I understand she had been carrying something far heavier than grief. A burden, a secret, one she had protected almost her entire life. And somehow, that old coat was the key to all of it. The last winter my mother was alive was colder than usual. Snow covered the sidewalks for weeks, and every morning the trees outside her bedroom window looked as though they had been carved from white glass. She had already begun slowing down by then. Walking from the bedroom to the kitchen required a pause halfway down the hallway, and although she insisted she was perfectly fine, everyone could see her strength quietly slipping away. I visited every afternoon after finishing work. We had developed a comfortable routine over the years. I would bring groceries, help prepare dinner, straighten the living room, and sit beside her with a cup of tea while she shared stories I had somehow never heard before. It amazed me that after an entire lifetime together, she could still surprise me with memories from decades earlier. Sometimes she spoke about growing up during difficult times. Other days she remembered neighbors whose names I had never heard or childhood adventures that sounded almost unbelievable. Yet no matter what story she told, there was one subject she consistently avoided: my father. Whenever the conversation drifted too close to him, she would smile softly, stir her tea, and gently guide us toward another topic. I respected her silence because grief belongs to each person differently. Some people heal by talking. Others protect themselves by remaining quiet. One rainy afternoon, while putting away freshly washed clothes, I opened the hallway closet looking for an empty hanger. There it was, the old brown coat. It hung exactly where it always had, protected inside a faded cloth garment bag whose zipper barely worked anymore. I smiled to myself, remembering how many times I had suggested replacing it. "Mom," I called from the hallway. "You still have this old thing?" She looked toward the closet without answering immediately. Finally, she nodded. "Of course. You know nobody's ever going to wear it." "I know. So, why keep it?" For a moment, she didn't answer. Instead, she watched me with an expression that was strangely difficult to understand. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't happiness either. It felt almost like she was measuring something invisible. Then she quietly said, "Because one day you'll understand." I laughed. "You've been saying that since I was a teenager. And one day I'll finally be right." I closed the closet and forgot about the conversation almost instantly. At the time, it seemed like one more harmless mystery belonging to an elderly woman who had collected hundreds of sentimental habits over the years. I had no reason to believe that ordinary-looking coat carried any greater importance than an old family photograph or a worn-out recipe book. Looking back now, I realized something else happened that afternoon. As I closed the closet door, I noticed my mother's eyes following the coat, not me. She watched it with the kind of attention people usually reserve for someone they love. I didn't understand the significance of that look then. Years later, it would haunt me. Her health declined rapidly over the following months. The doctors were kind but honest. There wasn't much left they could do, except keep her comfortable. Family members began visiting more often. My children came every weekend. Neighbors brought casseroles. Old friends stopped by carrying flowers and memories from a lifetime I had only partially known. Through all of it, my mother remained remarkably calm. She never spoke about being afraid. She never complained. She simply thanked everyone for coming and asked about their families before insisting they not worry about her. On her final evening, I stayed beside her bed long after everyone else had gone home. The house was silent except for the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. She reached for my hand. Her fingers had become so light that it felt as though she were barely touching me. There was no long speech, no dramatic confession, no explanation. She looked directly into my eyes and whispered only one sentence: "Promise me you'll never throw away my old coat." I frowned slightly. "The coat?" She nodded. "Promise me." "I promise." Only then did she smile. It was the most peaceful smile I had seen on her face in months. Within hours, she was gone. The days following my mother's funeral passed in a blur that still feels unreal whenever I think about them. The house, once filled with quiet conversations and the comforting sound of her footsteps, became crowded with relatives carrying cardboard boxes, folding chairs, and opinions about what should happen next. Everyone wanted to help, or at least they believed they were helping. My cousins sorted kitchen cabinets. My brother emptied the garage. My aunt carefully wrapped old dishes in newspaper while deciding which ones deserved to stay in the family. Every room slowly lost the personality that had taken my mother a lifetime to build. It amazed me how quickly a person's entire existence could be reduced to piles labeled keep, donate, and throw away. I wasn't ready for any of it, yet decisions had to be made. Late on the second afternoon, my brother opened the hallway closet. "Oh," he sighed. "Here's another thing." He pulled out the old brown coat. It looked even older than I remembered. Years of careful storage had preserved it surprisingly well, but time had still left its mark. The fabric had faded into uneven shades of brown. The collar showed signs of wear. One sleeve had been repaired so neatly that only someone looking closely would notice the stitches. My aunt barely glanced at it. That can go straight into the donation pile. I don't think anyone would even take it, one cousin laughed. Then throw it away. I stood quietly across the room. Nobody noticed. My brother folded the coat over one arm. I'll put it with the trash bags. The words hit me harder than I expected.
No.
Everyone turned toward me. What? We're keeping it. He looked surprised.
Why?
I opened my mouth and realized I didn't actually have an answer. Because Mom asked me to. Those words sounded almost childish inside my own head. Instead, I simply said, I'd rather keep it. My aunt smiled sympathetically. Margaret, sweetheart, grief makes us hold on to things we don't really need. It's only a coat. You'll feel better once the house is cleaned out. Maybe she was right. Maybe everyone else saw the situation more clearly than I did. But then I remembered my mother's face during our last conversation. She hadn't asked me to keep the furniture. She hadn't mentioned her jewelry. She hadn't cared about the family photographs. The only thing she had asked me to protect was that coat. I walked across the room and gently took it from my brother's hands. I'm keeping it. Nobody argued after that. Instead, they exchanged the kind of quiet glances families often share when they think someone is acting emotionally instead of rationally. I couldn't blame them. If our situations had been reversed, I probably would have thought the same thing. The coat wasn't beautiful. It wasn't valuable. There was nothing remarkable about it. At least, nothing anyone could see. After the house had finally been emptied, I carried the coat to my own home. I almost placed it in the bedroom closet. Instead, without really knowing why, I hung it in the hallway closet near the front door, almost exactly where it had always been in my mother's house.
It felt right.
Life slowly returned to normal. Weeks became months. Months became years. Sometimes I noticed the coat while putting away winter jackets. Sometimes I brushed dust from the shoulders exactly as my mother used to do. Occasionally, I wondered whether I should finally donate it. Every single time, I heard her voice. Promise me. So I closed the closet and walked away. I never searched its pockets, never examined the lining, never questioned whether there was something hidden inside. The promise, somehow, had become larger than my curiosity. I believed I was simply honoring my mother's memory. I had no idea she had counted on exactly that. 30 years is a strange amount of time. It's long enough for children to become parents, for neighborhoods to change beyond recognition, and for memories to lose the sharp edges that once made them feel so vivid. Looking back now, those decades seem to have disappeared in the blink of an eye. Seasons came and went. Christmases filled the house with laughter before becoming quieter each year. Birthdays passed, grandchildren were born, friends moved away, and people I had once believed would always be part of my life slowly became photographs on bookshelves. Through every joy and every loss, one small detail remained exactly the same. The old brown coat stayed hanging in the corner of my hallway closet, untouched, waiting, as though time itself had forgotten it existed. Every autumn, I repeated the same routine. I took out the heavier jackets, folded away the summer clothes, checked scarves and gloves, and cleaned the closet before winter arrived. My hands passed over that coat every single year. Sometimes I brushed a little dust from its shoulders exactly the way my mother used to. Sometimes I smiled as I remembered her carefully hanging it back after inspecting every seam with almost ceremonial attention. I never thought much about it. It had become part of the house, almost like the grandfather clock in the hallway or the old rocking chair on the porch. It simply belonged there. Richard noticed it only once, several years after we had moved into our second home. While helping me organize the closet, he pulled the coat slightly forward and asked, almost jokingly, "You've had this thing since before we got married. Are you ever planning to wear it?" I laughed and shook my head. "I've never worn it." He looked surprised. "Then why keep it?" I answered with the same explanation I had given everyone else over the years. because I promised my mother I would." He stared at me for a moment before smiling warmly. "Then I suppose that's reason enough." That was Richard. He never mocked sentimental things. He understood that some promises carry a weight no outsider can measure. Life continued moving forward. Our children graduated, married, and built families of their own. Weekends that had once been filled with soccer games, school concerts, and noisy dinners slowly transformed into peaceful afternoons interrupted only by visits from grandchildren. Richard retired before I did and discovered a passion for restoring old furniture in the garage. I often watched him sanding worn wooden tables or repairing broken rocking chairs while humming songs from his youth. He always said old things deserved a second chance if someone was willing to look beyond their appearance. Looking back now, I find it strangely ironic that he understood old furniture better than either of us understood that forgotten coat hanging only a few steps away. When I finally retired, we settled into a rhythm that felt almost perfect. Every morning we drank coffee together on the porch while watching the neighborhood wake up. Every evening we walked slowly around the block, greeting familiar faces and discussing ordinary things that somehow became precious simply because we shared them. We talked about taking one last long trip together. We dreamed about visiting places we had postponed seeing while raising our children. We believed we had plenty of time left. We were wrong. Richard suffered a massive heart attack only a few weeks after his 72nd birthday. It happened so suddenly that even now I sometimes replay that morning in my mind, searching for signs that never existed. One moment, he was smiling across the breakfast table, asking whether we should plant roses in the spring. Less than an hour later, I was riding in an ambulance praying for a miracle that never came. By sunset, I found myself standing alone in a hospital corridor while a doctor quietly apologized for something that no apology could ever repair. Losing my mother had hurt deeply, but losing Richard was different. My mother had given me life. Richard had shared that life with me for nearly 5 decades. Every habit I had developed, every routine that made a house feel like home, somehow included him. His slippers remained beside the bed. His reading glasses rested on the living room table. His favorite coffee mug stayed in the cabinet exactly where he always kept it. For months, I couldn't move any of those things. It felt as though changing the smallest detail would somehow erase him completely. Eventually, however, life demanded that I continue. One object at a time, I began organizing the house. Some clothes were donated. Old paperwork was shredded. Boxes in the attic were finally sorted after years of postponing the task. Every small accomplishment felt like another painful goodbye, yet I knew Richard would have wanted me to keep living instead of preserving a museum dedicated to grief. Then, on an unusually cold January afternoon almost a year after his passing, I carried a large donation box into the hallway and opened the closet. I intended to remove anything I no longer needed. Winter coats, old boots, scarves I hadn't worn in years. My hands moved confidently from hanger to hanger until they reached the familiar brown sleeve I had touched hundreds of times before. I stopped. There it was again. My mother's coat. 30 years had passed since I made that promise beside her bed, and suddenly I found myself wondering whether I had already honored it long enough. Surely she couldn't have expected me to keep an old coat forever. Perhaps 3 decades of loyalty had fulfilled whatever wish she had been trying to protect. I slowly lifted the coat from its hanger. The fabric felt rough beneath my fingers, but something immediately caught my attention. It seemed heavier than I remembered. Not dramatically heavy, just unusual. I frowned and shifted it from one hand to the other. Old wool could certainly weigh more than modern materials, I told myself. That had to be the explanation. Yet as I adjusted the collar, I heard a faint sound from somewhere inside the lining. It was soft, almost too quiet to notice, like dry paper gently rubbing against fabric. I froze. Curious now, I pressed one side of the coat with the palm of my hand. The sound came again. A delicate crackling, unmistakable this time. My heartbeat quickened. In 30 years, I had never once searched its pockets, never examined the inside, never questioned why my mother had protected it so carefully. But standing alone in that silent hallway, with winter wind tapping softly against the windows, I realized my curiosity had finally become stronger than the promise itself. Slowly, almost afraid of what I might find, I slipped my hand toward the inside pocket. My fingers hesitated only for a moment before slipping inside the pocket. It felt deeper than I expected, almost as though the lining had been sewn differently from the other side. The wool was cold from hanging near the front door all winter, and for an instant I wondered if I should stop. 30 years had passed without me looking. Another 30 seconds wouldn't make any difference. Yet something inside me refused to let go. Slowly I reached farther until my fingertips brushed against something stiff. It wasn't fabric. It wasn't a handkerchief or an old receipt someone had forgotten years earlier. Whatever it was had sharp, perfectly straight edges. My pulse quickened. Carefully, I pinched the object between my fingers and began pulling it toward the opening. It resisted slightly, as though it had been tucked into place long ago. When it finally emerged, I found myself staring at a yellowed envelope sealed with age. The paper had darkened over the decades, and the corners were soft from time, but it had remained remarkably well preserved inside the coat. There was no stamp, no mailing address, no return label, only a single line written across the front in my mother's unmistakable handwriting. For Margaret, only when the time is right. Asterisk, asterisk. For several seconds, I simply stood there unable to breathe. My name, written decades earlier. My mother had hidden something inside this coat, knowing that one day I would eventually find it. Not by accident. Not because someone else searched the pockets. She had trusted that I would keep my promise long enough for the right time to arrive. I carried the envelope into the living room and sat in Richard's old chair. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the curtains, illuminating tiny particles of dust floating in the air. The house was completely silent except for the ticking clock on the mantel. It was the same silence I had heard on the night my mother died, and suddenly I felt as though the years separating those moments had disappeared. The envelope trembled slightly in my hands. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. Another part was afraid that whatever waited inside might forever change the memory I had carefully preserved of my parents. We often believe we know everything about the people who raised us simply because we shared a home with them. Age teaches us the opposite. Every parent has chapters their children never read, sacrifices they never mention, and fears they quietly carry so the next generation doesn't have to. I traced my thumb gently across my mother's handwriting. Even after all those years, I could still recognize every curve of every letter. She had beautiful penmanship, the kind schools no longer teach. As a child, I used to watch her write birthday cards and grocery lists with the same careful precision. She believed handwriting revealed character. People should be able to feel your respect through your words, she often said. Looking at that envelope now, I could almost imagine her sitting at the kitchen table late at night, carefully writing my name while making sure no one else was watching. Finally, I slid one finger beneath the old seal. The paper separated with a faint crackle that seemed impossibly loud inside the quiet room. I unfolded a single sheet, expecting perhaps a short farewell or a sentimental message she had never found the courage to say aloud. Instead, the very first sentence made my heart stop. If you are reading this, it means I have protected the truth for as long as I could. I read it again, then a third time. Protected the truth? My mother had never spoken dramatically. She wasn't the kind of woman who exaggerated or invented mysteries. If she had written those words, she meant them exactly as they appeared. My eyes continued down the page. Everything you were told about your father's last winter was a lie. The room seemed to tilt around me. For my entire life, I had believed I knew how my father died. Everyone in the family told the same story. The neighbors repeated it. His death certificate confirmed it. There had never been any reason to question what happened. Until that moment, with one single sentence, my mother had shattered 30 years of certainty. For several long moments, I couldn't continue reading. The letter rested on my lap while I stared at the fireplace without truly seeing it. My father's last winter.
A lie.
The words refused to settle into something my mind could accept. I had spent nearly 70 years believing I understood the story of my parents' lives. They had married young, worked hard, raised a family, survived difficult years together, and eventually my father became ill and passed away during one particularly harsh winter. That was the story everyone knew. It had never changed. It had never been questioned. It had become one of those family truths repeated so often that nobody imagined there could be another version hidden beneath it. I closed my eyes and tried to remember my father as clearly as possible. Memory is a curious thing. We think we remember people exactly as they were, but after enough years we begin remembering the stories we tell about them instead. I could still picture his smile when he came home from work, his rough hands lifting me onto his shoulders, the smell of sawdust that clung to his jackets after long days at the lumber mill. I remembered how he always whistled while repairing things around the house, and how my mother would quietly smile whenever she heard him before he even opened the front door. They never appeared to be wealthy, but they seemed happy. At least, that is what I had always believed. With trembling hands, I looked back at the letter. Asterisk, Margaret, there are things a child should never have to carry. That is why I stayed silent. Not because I wanted to deceive you, but because I wanted you to have a peaceful childhood. Some truths become lighter with time. Others only become heavier. I prayed this one would disappear before you ever needed to know it. Asterisk. My throat tightened. Even after her death, my mother was still trying to protect me. Asterisk. The coat belonged to your father during the last winter we spent together. He asked me to hide something inside it. He made me promise that no one, not even you, should ever find it unless there was absolutely no other choice. I kept that promise until the day I realized I would not be here much longer. Then I understood the responsibility would become yours. Asterisk. I slowly lowered the page. The coat. It hadn't simply been an old piece of clothing. It had become a hiding place. A silent guardian protecting something my parents believed the world should never discover too soon. Suddenly I understood why my mother had never allowed anyone to touch it, why she carefully inspected it every winter, and why her final request had focused on something that seemed so ordinary. She wasn't asking me to preserve a memory. She was asking me to preserve a secret. I continued reading, each sentence pulling me deeper into a past I had never known. Asterisk, everything changed during your father's final months. Strange men began coming to the house while you were at school. They never stayed long. They always asked the same questions. Your father always gave the same answers. Every time they left, he looked older than before. Asterisk. I frowned. Strange men? No one had ever mentioned visitors. I searched my childhood memories, but I could find nothing. Then again, I had been only 9 years old. Children rarely notice what adults deliberately hide from them. Asterisk. He told me that if anything happened to him, I must never trust anyone who claimed they were only asking questions. He believed someone was searching for something that did not belong to them. He refused to tell me every detail because he wanted to protect me too. The less I knew, the safer we both would be. Asterisk. A chill ran through me despite the warmth inside the house. My father had lived with fear. Not ordinary worry about bills or illness, but genuine fear of people who kept returning for reasons he refused to explain. How had none of this ever reached the rest of the family? How had decades passed without a single relative mentioning those visits? Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. I remembered waking one night to voices downstairs. I had been very young. My bedroom door was slightly open, and I could hear my parents speaking in low whispers. At the time, I assumed they were discussing money or some ordinary problem adults often kept from children. Now, for the first time, I wondered whether that conversation had been about something entirely different. I couldn't remember the words, only the feeling. My mother's voice sounded frightened. My father's sounded calm, almost reassuring. The following morning, everything appeared normal again. Had that been one of those nights? Had those mysterious visitors already begun appearing? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. I reached the bottom of the page expecting the explanation to finally arrive, but instead my mother's final paragraph left me with an even greater mystery. Asterisk, the truth is not inside this letter, Margaret. The truth is still inside the coat. I never moved it. I never opened it. I only protected it. If you have decided to keep reading, then you must be brave enough to look where your father told me never to look. Asterisk. I lowered the paper and instinctively turned toward the hallway. The old coat was still hanging over the back of the chair where I had left it. Until that moment, I had believed the envelope was the secret. Now I understood. It had only been the beginning. I folded the letter with far more care than I had unfolded it. Somehow it no longer felt like a piece of paper. It felt like my mother's voice had crossed 3 decades to sit beside me one final time. I placed it gently on the coffee table and looked toward the coat. It rested quietly over the chair, exactly as I had left it, appearing as ordinary as ever. If a stranger had walked into my living room at that moment, they would have seen nothing more than an old winter coat ready for the donation pile. They would never have imagined that my parents had trusted it with a secret for more than half a century. For a few minutes, I simply watched it. My mind replayed every sentence from the letter over and over. The truth is still inside the coat. Those words echoed louder than anything else. My mother had admitted she had never looked. She had protected whatever my father hid without allowing her own curiosity to betray his trust. That realization alone overwhelmed me. I wasn't sure I could have done the same. 30 years had been difficult enough. She had carried that burden for even longer. Finally, I stood up and carried the coat to the dining room table where the afternoon light was strongest. I spread it carefully across the polished wood, smoothing every wrinkle with the palm of my hand. For the first time in my life, I truly examined it instead of merely seeing it. The fabric was thicker than modern coats, woven from heavy wool that had clearly been made to survive harsh winters. The collar had been repaired more than once. Several buttons had been replaced over the years, each slightly different from the others. My mother had stitched every repair so skillfully that most people would never notice them unless they looked closely. I began searching methodically. First, the outside pockets. They were empty except for a few grains of dust and tiny threads that had gathered over decades. Then the inside pocket where I had found the envelope. Nothing else remained there. I examined every seam with growing concentration, running my fingertips along the lining inch by inch. At first, everything appeared perfectly normal. Then my fingers paused. Near the bottom of the left side, hidden beneath the inner lining, I felt something unusual. Not an object. A difference. The stitching there wasn't identical to the rest. I leaned closer until my face was only inches from the fabric. My mother had always been an exceptional seamstress. Every stitch she made was perfectly straight, evenly spaced, almost impossible to distinguish from factory work. But these stitches, they were different. They weren't careless. In fact, they were incredibly precise. Too precise. The thread was ever so slightly darker than the surrounding fabric, and the pattern suggested someone had opened the lining and sewn it shut again with extraordinary patience, hoping no one would ever notice. A memory surfaced without warning. I was about 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while my mother repaired one of my father's shirts. I remembered asking why she always used thread that matched the fabric exactly. She smiled and said, "Good repairs aren't supposed to be noticed. If people can see where something was fixed, then it wasn't repaired properly." At the time, I thought she was teaching me about sewing. Now I wondered whether she had been describing this very coat. My heart began pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood, walked to the kitchen drawer, and returned with the smallest pair of embroidery scissors my mother herself had once given me. They were old now, their silver handles slightly worn from decades of use, but they remained as sharp as ever. I held them above the hidden seam and hesitated. The moment I cut those stitches, there would be no going back. For over 50 years that lining had remained closed. My father had hidden something there. My mother had protected it. And now, for reasons neither of them could have imagined, I was about to become the first person in decades to discover what they had sacrificed so much to keep hidden. Taking a slow breath, I slid the tiny blade beneath the first stitch and gently snipped the thread. 1 stitch became 2, then 3. The seam slowly opened, revealing a narrow space between the layers of fabric. I reached inside. Almost immediately, my fingertips brushed against something wrapped in oilcloth. It was small, flat, and carefully folded. As I pulled it free, a faint scent of old leather and cedar escaped from inside the coat, as though the secret itself had been waiting patiently all those years for someone to finally set it free. The bundle was surprisingly light. After everything my imagination had created over the past hour, I expected something heavier, something dramatic enough to justify decades of silence. Instead, it rested quietly in my hands, wrapped in faded oilcloth that had become stiff with age. Whoever had folded it had done so with extraordinary care, sealing every corner against moisture and time. My father had clearly intended for whatever was inside to survive many years, perhaps even longer than he expected to live. I carried the bundle back to the dining room table and placed it beside my mother's letter. For a long moment, I simply looked at both objects together. It struck me that they represented my parents in completely different ways. My mother's secret had been written with words, gentle and protective, always trying to prepare me emotionally before revealing the truth. My father's secret, on the other hand, had been hidden in silence. No explanation. No instructions beyond trusting my mother to protect it. Their personalities were still speaking through the choices they had made decades earlier. My hands trembled slightly as I untied the brittle cotton string wrapped around the oilcloth. The knot came loose more easily than I expected, as though time itself had patiently waited for this exact moment. Slowly, I unfolded the protective layers until several objects appeared on the table. The first was a small leather notebook, worn smooth along the edges from years of handling. Its cover had darkened with age, and one corner showed signs of water damage, but it remained intact. There were no initials engraved on the front, no title, nothing to reveal its purpose. Beneath it rested a brass key unlike any I had ever seen. It was longer than an ordinary house key, beautifully crafted, with intricate patterns carved into the handle. Finally, tucked underneath both items, lay a black and white photograph folded neatly in half. I reached for the photograph first. The paper felt fragile, forcing me to unfold it with extreme care. At first I smiled automatically. It showed my father standing beside another man in front of what appeared to be an old brick building. They looked younger than I had ever known him, perhaps in their early 30s. My father was smiling broadly, one arm resting across the other man's shoulder, as though they were lifelong friends. Then my smile disappeared. I had never seen the man standing beside him. Not once. Every family photograph I had ever known had been displayed somewhere in my mother's house. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, weddings, picnics, school graduations, she treasured every memory. Yet this photograph had never appeared in any album, never sat inside a frame, never been mentioned in conversation. Whoever this man was, my parents had deliberately erased him from our visible history. I turned the photograph over. Written on the back, in my father's handwriting, were only 6 words. If anything happens, trust only Daniel. Daniel. I whispered the name aloud, hoping it might awaken some forgotten childhood memory. Nothing. I searched every corner of my mind. Family gatherings, holidays, funerals, weddings, neighbors, friends from church, my father's coworkers. No, Daniel. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. That frightened me more than I expected. How could my father have trusted someone enough to leave behind a message like that while I, his own daughter, had never even heard the man's name? I carefully placed the photograph aside and picked up the leather notebook. The elastic band holding it closed had become brittle and snapped the moment I touched it. I opened the first page, expecting perhaps a diary or journal. Instead, I found columns of names.
Dozens of them.
Each name had a date written beside it. Some included addresses. Others contained only short handwritten notes in the margins. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but every few pages I recognized someone from my childhood. A neighbor. A local shop owner. A man who used to attend our church before disappearing from town unexpectedly. Why would my father keep such a list? I turned another page. More names. Then another. Near the middle of the notebook, one entry made me stop breathing. My mother's name, written beneath it, was my own. Only 9 years old, the exact age I had been during my father's final winter. I stare at the page in complete disbelief. Why would my father create a notebook containing our names? And why? Did every name have a date beside it? I swallowed hard and looked toward the final object still resting quietly on the table. The old brass key. Until that moment, it had seemed like the least important item. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure anymore. For several minutes, I couldn't take my eyes off the brass key. It rested quietly on the table beside the notebook and the photograph, catching the late afternoon light in a way that made every tiny engraving stand out. It wasn't decorative, yet someone had clearly taken pride in making it. The handle was heavier than modern keys, shaped almost like a small crest, while the shaft was unusually long, suggesting it belonged to something much older than an ordinary front door. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my fingers. There were no numbers stamped into the metal, no manufacturer's name, no tag explaining where it belonged. It existed without any clue to its purpose, as though my father had expected the key itself to mean something one day. I searched my memory again. My parents had never owned a safe. We never rented a storage unit. There had been no cabin in the woods, no vacation house, no family property waiting to be inherited. Ours had always been a simple life. My father worked hard, paid his bills on time, repaired whatever broke instead of buying something new, and rarely spoke about the past. If he possessed a key important enough to hide inside his own coat for decades, then it opened something he never wanted anyone else to discover. My attention returned to the notebook. This time I began reading more carefully, instead of simply flipping through its pages. Every name had been written with the same neat handwriting I remembered from the notes my father used to leave on the refrigerator. Some entries contained only dates. Others included short observations beside the names. Moved away. Asked too many questions. Can be trusted. Never returned. None of it made sense. It didn't resemble a diary or an address book. It looked more like a record of people my father had been quietly observing. The farther I read, the stranger it became. Several names had been crossed out with a single straight line. Not angrily, not carelessly. Just one calm stroke through the middle, as though each entry had simply reached its conclusion. Next to others, my father had written small symbols instead of words. A circle, a triangle, occasionally a tiny star. I searched for a pattern but couldn't find one. Whatever system he had created existed only inside his own mind. Then I noticed something I had completely overlooked.
The dates.
At first glance they appeared random, but after reading several pages I realized they weren't birthdays or anniversaries. They followed a sequence. One name appeared in March, another in April, several more in May. They moved steadily forward through the years until reaching the final pages, where the dates stopped abruptly only weeks before my father's death. He had been updating this notebook right until the end. That realization sent another chill through me. Whatever had been happening during his final months wasn't a brief incident. It had continued over a long period of time, carefully documented page after page. I turned to the very last completed entry. There, beneath several unfamiliar names, I found one sentence written by itself across the bottom of the page. Asterisk, if this notebook survives, it means I ran out of time. Asterisk. I slowly leaned back in my chair. Ran out of time. Not if I die. Not if something happens. Those words sounded like a man who knew he was racing against something inevitable, someone who believed he was trying to finish a task before it became impossible. I closed the notebook and looked once more at the photograph of the unknown man. Daniel. The only person my father had specifically instructed me to trust. But how could I trust someone I had never met? If he had still been alive after all these years, he would likely be close to 90 years old. There was every chance he had passed away decades earlier. Even if he hadn't, where would I begin searching? My father had left me a name, but no address, no town, no explanation of who Daniel really was. Frustrated, I gathered the objects together and noticed something else tucked beneath the notebook. It was so thin that I had mistaken it for part of the oilcloth wrapping. A folded piece of paper. Unlike my mother's letter, this one wasn't addressed to anyone. It contained only a rough hand-drawn map. The drawing showed a country road, a narrow bridge, a small church, and an old train station marked with a single X. In the corner, written in my father's handwriting, were 7 words. Asterisk, the key belongs where the train stopped forever. Asterisk, I stared at the map for what felt like an eternity. I recognized that church. I recognized the bridge. They were less than an hour from the town where I had grown up. But the train station, it had been abandoned since before I was born. I unfolded the map several more times, convinced I had overlooked something important. The lines were simple, almost childlike, but unmistakably intentional. My father had never been an artist, yet he possessed the practical precision of someone accustomed to measuring twice before making a single cut. Every landmark had been placed with care. The bridge curved exactly where I remembered it. The small stone church sat beside the road just as it had throughout my childhood. Even the narrow creek running behind the cemetery appeared in roughly the correct position. Whoever followed that map wouldn't become lost. It had been drawn by someone who knew every mile of those roads by heart. The abandoned train station immediately came back to me, although I hadn't thought about it in decades. As children, my brother and I often begged our parents to drive past it whenever we visited relatives in the neighboring county. The station looked enormous through a child's eyes. Its brick walls had darkened with age, several windows were already broken, and vines had begun climbing over the wooden platform. Every adult seemed to tell a different story about why it had closed. Some claimed the railway company had changed its route. Others insisted a terrible accident had happened there. A few older neighbors whispered that the station had simply become too expensive to maintain after the town slowly disappeared. None of us children cared which version was true. To us, it was simply a mysterious place where trains no longer stopped. I hadn't visited that road since my father died. Life had quietly erased any reason to return. As I studied the map, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. One autumn afternoon, when I was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, my father had driven me home using a road I didn't recognize. I remembered asking why we weren't taking the usual highway. He smiled and said he wanted to show me a place that used to matter. We passed an old station with boarded-up windows, and I pressed my face against the car window trying to see inside before it disappeared behind a row of trees. I asked whether trains would ever return. He looked at the empty tracks for a long moment before answering softly, "Some places finish their job, even if nobody remembers what that job was." At the time I thought he was talking about trains. Now I wasn't so sure. I looked back at the brass key resting beside the map. The key belongs where the train stopped forever. The sentence suddenly felt less like a clue and more like an instruction. My father hadn't hidden the key, so someone could admire it. He expected whoever eventually found it to use it. That realization filled me with equal parts excitement and unease. I was nearly 70 years old. The sensible part of me wanted to fold everything back into the oilcloth, lock it inside a drawer, and pretend none of it had happened. But another part, the same part that had finally opened the coat after 30 years, knew I had already crossed the point where turning back was possible. Evening settled outside before I noticed how much time had passed. The room had grown darker, forcing me to switch on the old lamp beside Richard's chair. Its warm yellow light spread across the table, illuminating the notebook, the photograph, the map, and the key like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. I suddenly wished Richard were sitting across from me. He would have approached everything calmly, asking practical questions while I allowed my imagination to race ahead.
He always balanced me that way.
For the first time since his death, I caught myself speaking aloud as though he might still answer. "What would you do?" Only silence replied. Then I remembered something Richard often said whenever we faced difficult decisions. Asterisk, you'll regret the questions you never ask more than the answers you never wanted. Asterisk. I smiled despite the knot growing in my stomach. He was right. He usually was. I carefully returned my mother's letter to its envelope and placed the notebook, photograph, map, and brass key inside a small wooden box from my desk. Before closing the lid, I picked up the photograph one last time. My father's arm rested comfortably across Daniel's shoulder, both men smiling as though they shared a bond impossible to break. Behind them, barely visible in the background, stood a building with a familiar roofline. I leaned closer. My breath caught. It wasn't just any building. It was the abandoned train station. For years I had focused only on the two men in the photograph. Now, after seeing my father's map, I realized the station had been there all along, quietly waiting for me to notice it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photograph lying on the dining room table, my father's handwritten note on the back, and the abandoned station standing silently behind him. It was remarkable how one ordinary afternoon had managed to dismantle everything I thought I knew about my family's past. For 30 years, I had believed I was preserving nothing more than an old promise. Now I understood I had unknowingly become the guardian of a story that had waited decades for someone willing to finish it. By sunrise, I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to tell anyone. Not yet. My children loved me deeply, but they would immediately insist on coming with me. They would worry about my safety, question whether I should involve the police, or suggest that I was allowing grief and old family stories to cloud my judgment. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have agreed with them. But these weren't normal circumstances. My father had hidden the truth specifically for me. My mother had protected it specifically for me. Until I understood what I was dealing with, I felt the responsibility was mine alone. After breakfast, I packed a small bag as though I were leaving for an ordinary afternoon drive. I slipped the brass key into my coat pocket, placed the map inside a folder to keep it flat, and carefully returned everything else to the wooden box. Before leaving, I stood for a moment beside the hallway closet where my mother's old coat still hung open, its secret compartment exposed after more than half a century. I gently touched one sleeve and whispered, "I kept my promise, Mom. Now I need to understand why." The drive toward my hometown felt strangely familiar despite the years that had passed. The highway had changed, of course. New businesses stood where empty fields had once stretched for miles, and several small towns had grown far beyond what I remembered. Yet the farther I traveled, the more recognizable everything became. Old farmhouses appeared beside the road. Weathered fences followed the rolling hills. Church steeples emerged above clusters of trees exactly where they always had. It was as though time had chosen certain places to leave untouched. An hour later, I turned onto the narrow country road marked on my father's map. Immediately, memories began returning with surprising clarity. There was the small stone bridge where my brother and I used to count turtles in the creek below. A little farther stood the white church with its aging bell tower, still watching over the surrounding farmland exactly as it had throughout my childhood. Everything matched the drawing perfectly. My father hadn't exaggerated a single detail. The road eventually narrowed until cracked pavement replaced smooth asphalt. Grass grew along the edges and low tree branches leaned overhead, forming a tunnel of green that blocked much of the morning sunlight. It felt less like driving into another town and more like traveling backward through time. Then I saw it. The station. Even after all these years, it stood exactly where I remembered, though age had claimed even more of it than I expected. The brick walls remained solid, but many windows were broken or boarded shut. The wooden platform sagged noticeably near one end, and weeds had pushed through nearly every crack in the old pavement. Rust covered the abandoned tracks, disappearing into the distance beneath thick overgrowth. Nature had been patiently reclaiming the place for decades. I parked beneath an enormous oak tree and switched off the engine. Silence. Complete silence. No passing trains. No nearby traffic. Only wind moving gently through the trees and the occasional call of distant birds. For a long moment I remained inside the car, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. It suddenly occurred to me how absurd the entire situation might appear to anyone else. A nearly 70-year-old woman had driven across the county because of an old photograph, a mysterious key, and a letter hidden inside a winter coat. Yet despite the absurdity, I knew I belonged there. Stepping out of the car, I looked once more at the station. The faded sign above the entrance had become almost impossible to read, but a few weathered letters still remained. The same brick chimney from the photograph rose above the roofline. The same platform stretched alongside the tracks. My father and Daniel had stood only a few yards from where I now found myself. Slowly, I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the old brass key. For the first time since discovering it, I noticed something I had somehow overlooked. Tiny letters had been engraved along one edge of the handle. Not a company name, not a serial number, just 3 words. Waiting Room East. For several seconds, I simply stared at the tiny engraving. Waiting Room East. The letters were so small that I wondered how I had failed to notice them before. Years of oxidation had darkened the grooves, making them nearly invisible unless the light struck them at exactly the right angle. I turned the key over in my hand once more, tracing the inscription with my thumb. My father had left me an ordinary key. He had left me a destination. I looked toward the station again. Time had stripped away almost every sign that people had once gathered there. The platform was cracked and uneven, sections of the roof had partially collapsed, and vines covered much of the brickwork. It was difficult to imagine families once standing there with suitcases, children waving excitedly as trains arrived, conductors shouting final calls before departure. The station had become so forgotten that even nature seemed to believe no one would ever return. Crossing the old platform, every step echoed softly beneath my feet. Rotten wooden boards creaked under my weight, forcing me to move carefully. Several windows had been broken years earlier, allowing rain, wind, and leaves to drift freely inside. Through one opening, I could see what had once been the main ticket office. The counter still stood where it had always been, though covered with decades of dust. A faded timetable clung stubbornly to one wall, its paper curling at the edges until only a few station names remained readable. The silence felt different inside the building. Outside, it had been peaceful. Inside, it felt expectant, almost as though the station itself had been waiting. I unfolded my father's map once again. The small X wasn't drawn near the tracks or the entrance. It sat inside the eastern wing of the building, beyond what appeared to have been the passenger waiting area. I glanced down the dim corridor stretching away from the main hall. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, creating long bands of light across the dusty floor. Every footstep stirred tiny clouds of dust that danced lazily in the air before settling once again. As I walked deeper into the station, memories returned with surprising force. I suddenly remembered my father lifting me onto a wooden bench while we waited for something I could no longer recall. Had we actually entered this building together? Or was my mind trying to connect memories that had never belonged together? The older I became, the more I realized memory could be both wonderfully accurate and terribly deceptive. The corridor eventually ended at a heavy wooden door hanging slightly crooked on rusted hinges. Above it, barely visible beneath layers of peeling paint, were faded black letters. East Waiting Room. I stopped breathing. The engraving on the key hadn't been symbolic. It had been literal. The brass key suddenly felt much heavier in my hand. The old lock remained attached to the door despite decades of abandonment. Rust covered most of its surface, and at first glance it appeared permanently sealed. I almost laughed to myself. There was no chance a key hidden inside a coat for more than 50 years could possibly still work. Even so, I knelt before the lock. Carefully, I inserted the key. To my astonishment, it slid in perfectly. For a moment, nothing happened. I applied only the slightest pressure, expecting resistance. Instead, I heard a quiet metallic click. The mechanism moved as though it had been used only yesterday. A chill ran through my entire body. Someone had once told me that old locks seize when they're forgotten. This one hadn't forgotten anything. Slowly, I turned the handle. The door resisted at first, swollen from decades of moisture, then gave way with a long groan that echoed through the empty station. Dust drifted down from the frame as a cold, stale smell escaped from the dark room beyond. It wasn't the smell of decay. It was the smell of a place that had remained undisturbed for an impossibly long time. Sunlight reached only a few feet inside. The rest of the room disappeared into shadow. I stepped across the threshold. The waiting room was almost completely empty. Several broken wooden benches still lined the walls, their varnish long since faded away. A cracked cast-iron stove stood in one corner, surrounded by fallen plaster from the ceiling. Cobwebs stretched between light fixtures that hadn't worked for generations. At first glance, there seemed to be nothing remotely important about the room. Then I remembered the photograph. My father and Daniel hadn't been standing outside the station by accident. They had been standing directly in front of this very door. I slowly walked toward the far wall where sunlight illuminated a section of old wooden paneling. The notebook, the photograph, the key, none of them had led me here just to admire an abandoned room. Something was still missing. As I rested one hand against the wall, listening to the silence around me, my fingers brushed across one section of wood that felt strangely different from the rest. It sounded hollow. I pulled my hand back and pressed against the panel again, this time more deliberately. Every other section of the wall felt solid beneath my palm, backed by thick brick exactly as I expected from a building constructed nearly a century earlier. But this piece was different. The sound was unmistakable. Hollow. Not dramatically so, but enough to suggest there was empty space behind it. My father had spent years working with wood. He could identify hidden compartments simply by tapping a surface with his knuckles. As a little girl, I used to watch him repair cabinets and old furniture, amazed that he somehow knew where every loose board and hidden joint was located without taking anything apart. Standing inside that abandoned waiting room, I suddenly realized he might have built this hiding place using the very skills he practiced every day. I knelt carefully, brushing decades of dust away from the lower edge of the panel. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my knees while tiny particles floated through the beam of sunlight streaming from the broken window. At first I found nothing except old nails and cracked varnish. Then, almost hidden beneath several layers of paint, my fingertips discovered something no larger than the head of a coin. A tiny brass screw. Unlike every other nail holding the panel in place, this one had clearly been installed later. My heartbeat quickened. Someone had wanted this section to be removable. Slowly, I reached into my handbag and removed the small folding screwdriver I always carried for eyeglasses and loose cabinet handles. It was hardly the proper tool, but after a few careful turns the old brass screw began moving. The metal complained quietly before finally loosening enough for me to remove it completely. Nothing happened. The panel remained exactly where it was. I frowned and examined the edges more closely. That's when I noticed a barely visible gap along the right side. Years of dust had concealed it almost perfectly. Sliding my fingernails into the narrow opening, I pulled gently. The wood shifted. Only a fraction of an inch. But it moved. I pulled again, this time using both hands. With a low scraping sound that echoed through the empty station, the entire panel swung slowly outward like a hidden door. Behind it was a narrow compartment built directly into the wall. For several long seconds, I simply stared. It wasn't large, perhaps 18 inches deep and just wide enough to hold a few objects. Whoever had constructed it had done so with extraordinary care. From the outside, nothing suggested the space even existed. Without the key, the map, and my father's careful planning, I would have walked past that wall 100 times without suspecting anything. Inside the compartment rested a single metal box. It was old, painted dark green, with patches of rust spreading across its corners. Unlike the hidden compartment, the box itself wasn't locked. Instead, a faded leather strap wrapped around it twice before fastening with a simple brass buckle. Resting on top was another envelope, much smaller than the one hidden inside the coat. My name appeared once again. Margaret. Only this time the handwriting wasn't my mother's. It was my father's. My throat tightened immediately. I had spent decades wishing I could hear his voice one more time. Instead, here I was, standing inside an abandoned train station with a letter he had written, knowing there was a chance I would never receive it. My hands trembled so much that I had to sit on one of the old benches before opening it. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the ink remained perfectly legible. Asterisk, if you've reached this place, then your mother kept her promise. I prayed she would never have to pass this burden to you, but if she did, it means neither of us found another way. Asterisk. I stopped reading. The words hit me with unexpected force. He had never intended for me to carry this responsibility. He had hoped the secret would die with him. But life had chosen differently. Taking a slow breath, I continued. Asterisk, before you open the box, you must understand one thing. Everything inside belongs to people who trusted me when they had no one else. I was never protecting money. I was never protecting myself. I was protecting lives. Asterisk. I lowered the letter and stared at the unopened metal box resting only a few feet away. All this time I had imagined hidden gold, family documents, perhaps evidence of a crime. Instead, my father had written about people, real people, people who had trusted him enough to place something precious into his hands. And suddenly I understood why he had never spoken about any of it. Because some secrets aren't hidden to protect the person keeping them. They're hidden to protect everyone else. For a long time, I simply sat there holding my father's letter while staring at the metal box resting inside the hidden compartment. The waiting room remained completely silent. Dust drifted lazily through the narrow beams of sunlight entering from the broken windows, and somewhere outside, I heard the distant call of a crow. The entire station felt frozen in another era, as though it had been preserving this moment for decades. My father had written those words, knowing there was a real possibility I would never read them. Somehow, that realization made him feel closer than he had in years. I stood and carefully lifted the box from its hiding place. It was heavier than it appeared, but not because it contained anything made of metal or stone. The weight felt uneven, like stacks of paper shifting gently inside. I carried it to one of the old wooden benches and slowly loosened the worn leather strap wrapped around its lid. The buckle opened without resistance, almost as though someone had oiled it before hiding the box away all those years ago. Taking a deep breath, I lifted the lid. There was no money, no jewelry, no gold. Instead, the box was filled almost entirely with envelopes. Dozens of them. Each one was neatly arranged in rows, tied together with faded cotton ribbon. Every envelope had a person's name written across the front in careful handwriting. Some names matched those I had seen inside my father's notebook. Others were completely unfamiliar. None of the envelopes had ever been opened. Beneath the first bundle rested several folded legal documents, protected inside waxed paper to keep moisture away. Under those lay a small cloth pouch that produced a soft metallic sound when I lifted it. I resisted the urge to look inside immediately. Somehow, the envelopes seemed far more important. I picked up the first bundle and examined it more closely. Every envelope carried the same sentence beneath the recipient's name. To be returned when it is safe. Safe. Not when requested. Not after my death. Safe. That single word completely changed how I viewed everything my father had done. He hadn't been hiding valuables for himself. He had been safeguarding something for other people until whatever danger existed had finally disappeared. I untied one ribbon and carefully read several names. Some belonged to families I vaguely remembered from my childhood. Others belonged to people who had disappeared from town long before I was old enough to know them. One envelope was addressed to a schoolteacher I distinctly remembered attending my third-grade classroom. Another carried the name of the elderly pharmacist who used to give children peppermints whenever their parents filled prescriptions. I frowned. These weren't strangers connected by coincidence. They had all lived in our community. Why would so many different people trust my father with sealed envelopes? I returned the bundle to the box and unfolded the legal documents instead. The first page was a handwritten agreement signed by several individuals. Time had faded much of the ink, but enough remained readable for me to understand its purpose. The group had agreed that if anything happened to them, my father would become the temporary guardian of certain documents until each owner could safely reclaim them. Guardian. The word immediately reminded me of my mother. She had become the guardian after him. Then, unknowingly, I had become the guardian after her. The responsibility hadn't been inherited. It had simply been passed from one trusted pair of hands to another. My eyes drifted toward the cloth pouch still lying unopened beside the papers. This time I untied the small cord holding it closed. Inside were several old keys. Not one, 5. Each different. Each carefully labeled with tiny handwritten tags attached by thin wire. Locker 12. Mill Office. Deposit A. North Storage. The fifth tag had faded almost completely. Only one word remained visible. Daniel. I stared at it in complete silence. My father's friend. The man in the photograph. The only person he had instructed me to trust. Even after all these years, his name was still part of the secret. Suddenly, something else caught my attention. Tucked beneath the false bottom of the metal box was one final sheet of folded paper. Unlike everything else, it wasn't old. It looked newer. Much newer. The paper had yellowed only slightly. Someone had placed it there years after my father died. For several seconds, I simply stared at the folded sheet lying beneath the false bottom of the metal box. Everything else I had discovered clearly belonged to another era. The envelopes were yellowed with age, the legal documents were brittle around the edges, and my father's handwriting carried the unmistakable character of ink that had rested untouched for more than 50 years. This page was different. The paper was still firm. The folds were crisp. It had aged, certainly, but not nearly enough to have been hidden there at the same time as everything else. A single thought crossed my mind. Someone had opened this box after my father died. A chill ran slowly down my back. Until that moment, I had assumed the compartment had remained sealed since the day my father concealed it behind the wall. That assumption vanished instantly. If this paper was newer, then another person had discovered the hiding place before me, and had chosen to leave something behind instead of taking everything away. My first instinct was to look around the room. The waiting room remained silent. Dust floated lazily through the shafts of sunlight exactly as before. The broken benches hadn't moved. The old stove still stood forgotten in the corner. Yet suddenly the room no longer felt abandoned. It felt visited. I carefully unfolded the paper. The handwriting wasn't my father's, nor was it my mother's. It belonged to someone else entirely, firm, deliberate, slightly slanted to the right. There was no greeting. Only one sentence. If Margaret is reading this, then I was too late. I felt my heart pound against my ribs. Whoever had written this knew my name. Not only that, they had expected me to come here someday. My eyes continued down the page. Asterisk, your father kept his word until the very end. Your mother protected what remained longer than any of us believed possible. If this message reaches you instead of me, it means I failed to return before they were both gone. Asterisk. I lowered the page for a moment. They. The writer had known both of my parents. Only one name immediately came to mind. Daniel. My hands tightened around the letter as I continued reading. Asterisk, do not be frightened by the notebook. Most of the names belong to people who survived because your father refused to betray their trust. Others were never as fortunate. The envelopes are not evidence of a crime. They are evidence of promises. Asterisk, promises. The same word my mother had repeated throughout her life. The same word that had kept me from throwing away an old coat for 30 years. I suddenly realized that every important decision in my family's history seemed to revolve around a promise someone refused to break. The letter continued. Asterisk, if you found the key, then the station remained untouched. That is better than I dared hope. I checked this place once every few years after your father's death, always fearing someone else would discover it first. Thankfully, no one ever did. Asterisk. So someone really had been here, again and again, checking on the hiding place, protecting it, just as my parents had. I read the final paragraph twice before its meaning fully settled in. Asterisk, my name is Daniel Mercer. If I am still alive, you will find me where your father always knew I would return. If I am gone, ask for the Lighthouse Journal at the county library. It contains everything your father never had the chance to explain. Asterisk, Daniel. He was real. Not merely a name written on the back of an old photograph. He had survived. He had continued protecting my father's secret after his death. And somehow, he had expected that one day, I would come looking. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the same envelope as my father's note. Then I closed the metal box, securing the leather strap exactly as I had found it. Whatever this secret truly was, I finally understood one thing with absolute certainty. It wasn't over. My father had begun the story. My mother had preserved it. Daniel had guarded it from the shadows. And now, for reasons I still couldn't understand, it had become my turn. I didn't leave the station immediately. Instead, I sat alone on one of the old wooden benches, listening to the wind move through the broken windows while trying to understand how my life had changed so completely in less than 24 hours. The abandoned waiting room no longer felt like the end of a mystery. It felt like the beginning of one. Every answer I uncovered seemed to produce 3 new questions. My father had hidden documents that belonged to other people. My mother had protected them without ever opening the box. Daniel had secretly watched over the station for decades. And now, somehow, every road seemed to be leading toward a county library and something called the Lighthouse Journal. Before leaving, I carefully returned the removable wooden panel exactly as I had found it. I slid the compartment closed, tightened the small brass screw with my pocket screwdriver, and gently brushed away the fresh fingerprints I had left in the dust. It wasn't because I believed anyone was still searching for the compartment. It simply felt like the respectful thing to do. My father had spent years keeping that place hidden. Somehow, closing it one last time felt like thanking him. I carried the metal box to my car, placing it gently on the passenger seat beside the map and the photograph. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The old station slowly disappeared behind the trees until only the roofline remained visible. For a brief moment, I imagined my father standing on that platform beside Daniel exactly as they appeared in the photograph, both of them watching my car disappear down the road. The image was so vivid that I almost expected one of them to wave. The county library had changed far less than I expected. The building itself had been renovated, and a newer entrance welcomed visitors through automatic glass doors, but the original stone structure still stood proudly behind the additions. I hadn't entered that library since taking my own children there decades earlier. The familiar smell of books greeted me the moment I stepped inside, carrying with it memories of rainy afternoons spent reading while my mother searched for gardening magazines. Only a handful of people occupied the reading room. An elderly man slowly turned newspaper pages near the windows. 2 college students worked quietly at opposite ends of a large table. Behind the front desk sat a librarian with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun. She smiled warmly as I approached. "Can I help you?" I hesitated. The request sounded ridiculous even inside my own head. "I'm looking for the Lighthouse Journal." The smile disappeared from her face. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. She studied me for several long seconds before speaking again. "May I ask who told you about it?" I hadn't expected that question. For a brief moment I considered mentioning Daniel immediately, but something held me back. My father had spent his entire life deciding carefully whom to trust. Instinctively, I found myself doing the same. It belonged to my father. She remained silent. Then she quietly asked one more question. "What was his name?" I answered without hesitation. "Thomas Bennet." The change in her expression was impossible to miss. Recognition. Not vague familiarity. Recognition. She slowly stood from behind the desk, glanced around the nearly empty library as though making certain nobody was listening, and lowered her voice. "I haven't heard that name in almost 40 years. A strange mixture of relief and apprehension settled over me. Someone else remembered him. Not as my father. Not as an ordinary man from a small town. As someone connected to whatever secret had survived all these years. Without another word, the librarian disappeared through a door marked staff only. Several minutes passed. Long enough for me to wonder whether she had changed her mind. Finally, she returned carrying a worn black ledger almost 12 inches thick. Unlike every other library book, it bore no barcode, no classification label, and no title on its spine. She placed it carefully on the desk between us. "This never enters the public catalog," she said quietly. "Very few people have ever asked to see it." My eyes dropped to the faded cover. Pressed into the old leather in nearly invisible gold lettering were 2 simple words. Keeper's Journal. The librarian didn't hand me the journal immediately. Instead, she rested both hands on its worn leather cover and looked at me with an expression that was difficult to describe. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't fear. If anything, it resembled the quiet relief of someone who had spent years protecting an object without knowing whether the person meant to receive it would ever appear. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence inside the library felt strangely similar to the silence I had experienced inside the abandoned station, peaceful on the surface, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of something important. "You should read this here," she finally said. "It has never left this building." I nodded without arguing. She gently pushed the journal toward me. The last person who asked for it was an elderly gentleman almost 15 years ago. My heart skipped. "Daniel?" She hesitated before answering. I never asked his name. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Whoever he was, the librarian had understood that questions weren't always welcome. My father would have appreciated that. She led me to a small reading room near the back of the building, away from the main tables. The room contained only a single wooden desk, 2 chairs, and a tall window overlooking the old courthouse lawn. Before leaving, she quietly closed the door behind me, giving me complete privacy. For a few moments, I simply stared at the journal. The leather cover had become smooth from decades of careful handling. Small cracks spread across the spine, and several corners had been repaired with remarkably skillful stitching. It reminded me immediately of my mother's sewing. Someone had loved this book enough to preserve it instead of replacing it. Slowly, I opened the cover. The first page was almost blank. Only one sentence appeared in elegant handwriting. "Every promise deserves a witness." Beneath it, a signature. My father, Thomas Bennett. I closed my eyes. For a brief instant, I simply allowed myself to breathe. Until that moment, every discovery had depended on hidden letters, forgotten photographs, or clues buried inside old coats. Now, for the first time, I was looking directly at words my father had intended others to read. Not secret notes hidden inside walls. A record. He wanted this journal to survive. Turning the page, I found the first dated entry. It had been written nearly 55 years earlier. Asterisk. "Today I accepted the responsibility that no court could recognize and no government would ever understand. 5 families placed their trust in my hands. They did not ask me to hide wealth. They asked me to protect their futures until fear no longer ruled their lives." Asterisk. I leaned closer. Fear. There was that word again. It appeared throughout every message my parents had left behind. The next paragraph explained a little more. Asterisk. "Some people protect money. Others protect buildings. I was asked to protect memories, names, letters, deeds, photographs, and the truth about people who deserve the chance to begin again." Asterisk. My eyes slowly scanned every line. There was nothing about spies. Nothing about treasure. Nothing about criminal organizations. Instead, my father had quietly become the guardian of documents belonging to families who had been trying to disappear from someone or something they feared deeply. Another page revealed more. Asterisk. "No one must ever believe these records belong to me. The moment they become my possessions, the promises are broken. I am only their keeper until each rightful owner returns." Asterisk. Keeper. The title on the journal suddenly made perfect sense. Not owner. Not collector. Keeper. A guardian whose entire purpose was to preserve what belonged to someone else. I continued reading until one paragraph caused my hands to freeze. Asterisk. "If one day my daughter reads these pages, then events unfolded exactly as I prayed they never would. Margaret, if this responsibility reaches you, remember one lesson above all others. Never ask who deserves the truth. Ask who is ready for it." Asterisk. I stared at my own name for what felt like an eternity. He had written directly to me, more than half a century earlier. He knew there was a chance this burden would someday become mine. He simply hoped it never would. I slowly turned the next page. At the very top, a different handwriting appeared for the first time. Only 2 words. Daniel Mercer. And beneath his name, he had written, asterisk, "Thomas was never supposed to carry this alone." Asterisk. For a long moment, I simply stared at Daniel's handwriting. It looked remarkably different from my father's. Where my father wrote with measured precision, every letter perfectly aligned as though he had carefully considered each word before placing it on paper, Daniel's writing carried a quiet urgency. The strokes leaned forward slightly, the ink pressed more firmly into the page, giving the impression of someone who understood that time was always running short. It wasn't untidy. It simply belonged to a man who had spent much of his life moving instead of waiting. I carefully turned the page and began reading. Asterisk. Thomas believed promises should never belong to only one person. He always said that if a secret depends on a single pair of hands, sooner or later it will disappear forever. That is why we made our agreement. If either one of us failed, the other would continue protecting those who had trusted us. Asterisk. I paused. For the first time, I began to understand why the photograph existed. It wasn't simply a picture of two friends standing outside an old train station. It was evidence of a partnership. My father had never been acting alone. Daniel continued. Asterisk. People often assume courage looks loud. They imagine heroes standing in front of crowds or facing danger with dramatic speeches. Thomas taught me something entirely different. Real courage often looks like an ordinary man returning home every evening, eating dinner with his family, smiling at his daughter, and never allowing anyone to notice the weight he carried during the day. Asterisk. My throat tightened. That sentence described my father perfectly. Growing up, I had never considered him extraordinary. He repaired broken fences, shoveled snow before the neighbors woke up, volunteered at church whenever someone needed help, and never raised his voice unless absolutely necessary. If someone had asked me to describe him, I would have called him dependable, honest, quiet. Now I realized those ordinary qualities had been precisely what made him extraordinary. The next several pages explained how the entire arrangement had begun. Many years earlier, during a period when several local families suddenly disappeared from neighboring towns, my father and Daniel had quietly agreed to safeguard documents for people who feared losing everything they owned. Some families had fled abusive relatives. Others escaped dangerous financial disputes. A few were protecting legal records that dishonest individuals had desperately tried to destroy. Rather than trusting banks or government offices that could be searched, they chose something much simpler. Two ordinary men whom nobody would ever suspect. The notebook suddenly made sense. Those names weren't targets. They were responsibilities. Every date represented the last time my father confirmed someone remained safe or successfully reclaimed what had been entrusted to him. The names crossed out weren't victims. They were people whose promises had finally been fulfilled. Their envelopes had been returned. Their burdens had ended. I felt tears gathering as decades of misunderstanding quietly dissolved. My father hadn't lived in fear because he was guilty of something. He had lived carefully because other people's futures depended on his discretion. Daniel's writing became noticeably more personal as the journal continued. Asterisk. Thomas often worried about Margaret. Not because she was weak, but because she was kind. He feared kindness sometimes convinces people to trust too quickly. More than once he told me, if my daughter ever inherits this responsibility, remind her that compassion should guide her heart, but wisdom must guide her decisions. Asterisk. I smiled through my tears. That sounded exactly like him. He had always found gentle ways to teach important lessons without making them feel like lectures. Even after all these years, he was still trying to guide me. Near the bottom of the page, another passage immediately caught my attention. Asterisk. If you are reading this after both Thomas and I are gone, there is one final responsibility remaining. Only one envelope was never reclaimed. Not because its owner forgot, because its owner never returned. Asterisk. My eyes instinctively drifted toward the metal box resting beside my chair. One envelope. Still waiting. For someone who would never come back. I quickly turned the page. Daniel had written only a single sentence beneath it. Asterisk. When you find that envelope, you will finally understand why Thomas asked your mother never to throw away his old coat. Asterisk. I closed the journal slowly, resting both hands on its worn leather cover while trying to steady my breathing. Every page had changed my understanding of my father. For decades, I had quietly admired him as a good man. Now I realized that good barely scratched the surface of who he had truly been. He had chosen a life in which his greatest accomplishments could never be celebrated publicly. Every promise he kept had required silence instead of recognition. Every act of courage had been hidden beneath the appearance of an ordinary husband and father. I suddenly understood why my mother had loved him with such quiet devotion. She hadn't merely lost her husband all those years ago. She had lost the only other person who fully understood the burden she would spend the rest of her life protecting. The librarian was waiting outside the reading room when I finally emerged. She didn't ask what I had found. She simply looked at my face, nodded gently, and said, "You understand now." It wasn't a question. Somehow she already knew. I thanked her for trusting me with the journal and carefully asked whether Daniel Mercer had ever left a forwarding address or any contact information during his last visit. She shook her head. He always arrived alone. He stayed for an hour or two, read a few pages, wrote something near the end, and quietly left. He never borrowed books. He never spoke about himself. She hesitated before adding, but every time he came, he asked whether anyone named Margaret Bennet had ever visited. A lump formed in my throat. He had been waiting for me, perhaps for years, perhaps until he realized I would never come. I thanked her again, returned the journal exactly as I had received it, and carried the metal box back to my car. The drive home felt completely different from the drive that morning. When I left my house, I had been chasing a mystery. Now I was carrying the final chapter of a promise that had survived 3 generations. The responsibility no longer felt mysterious. It felt deeply human. As soon as I reached home, I cleared the dining room table once again. The afternoon sunlight had begun fading into the warm colors of early evening, casting long shadows across the room exactly as it had the day I first discovered the hidden envelope inside the coat. I untied the bundles one by one, this time comparing every envelope with the names listed in my father's notebook. Daniel had been right. One after another, each crossed-out name matched an envelope that had apparently been returned years earlier. The remaining bundles represented promises that had eventually reached their rightful owners. Only one envelope remained without any corresponding mark. It rested by itself at the very bottom of the box. Unlike all the others, it wasn't tied with ribbon. It had been wrapped separately inside another layer of protective paper, almost as though my father wanted to make absolutely certain it could never be mistaken for the rest. Across the front appeared a name I had never seen before. Eleanor Whitmore. There was no address, no date, only one additional sentence written beneath her name in my father's careful handwriting. "If I cannot return this myself, forgive me." I whispered the words aloud. They didn't sound like instructions. They sounded like regret. Carefully, I searched the notebook once more until I found Eleanor's name. Unlike every other entry, hers occupied nearly an entire page. My father had written no addresses, no symbols, no brief observations. Only a single line. Asterisk, still waiting. Asterisk. Nothing else. No explanation. No final date. No indication that the promise had ever been fulfilled. I sat back in my chair, staring at the unopened envelope. For the first time since this journey had begun, I questioned whether I should break another promise. Every envelope inside that box belonged to someone else. My father had never opened them. Neither had Daniel. Neither had my mother. Did I have the right? Or was my responsibility simply to continue protecting the last one until I discovered what had happened to Eleanor Whitmore? As I wrestled with the decision, something slipped unnoticed from between the folded papers inside the envelope's protective wrapping. A small newspaper clipping drifted silently onto the table. I picked it up. The article was faded but still readable. The headline made my heart skip. Local schoolteacher vanishes without a trace. Beneath the headline, a black and white photograph. It showed a young woman standing outside an elementary school, smiling warmly at the camera. On the back of the clipping, written in my father's handwriting, were 5 words that changed everything once again. She never stopped looking. I picked up the newspaper clipping again, studying the young woman's face more carefully. She couldn't have been older than 30. Her smile carried the quiet confidence of someone who genuinely loved her work, and the children gathered around her in the photograph looked completely at ease. There was nothing remarkable about the image at first glance. It resembled hundreds of local newspaper articles celebrating teachers, volunteers, or community events. Yet the headline beneath it transformed everything. Local schoolteacher vanishes without a trace. I had expected to find a criminal investigation or a report about some unsolved mystery. Instead, the article described Eleanor Whitmore as a respected elementary school teacher who had suddenly resigned, packed a single suitcase, and disappeared without telling anyone where she intended to go. Friends believed she had suffered an emotional breakdown after a series of personal tragedies. The police searched briefly before concluding that she had probably chosen to begin a new life somewhere else. I read the article twice, then a third time. Something about it felt incomplete. Newspapers usually thrive on details, yet this report seemed strangely careful about what it omitted. It mentioned rumors but never explained them. It referred to private family circumstances without describing what those circumstances actually were. Even the final paragraph ended awkwardly, stating only that authorities believed there was no evidence of foul play. It was the kind of article that answered enough questions to satisfy the public while quietly avoiding the ones that mattered most. Turning the clipping over again, I traced my father's handwriting with my finger. Asterisk, she never stopped looking. Asterisk, looking for what? Or, looking for whom? I opened the notebook once more and searched every page for Eleanor's name. This time I paid attention not only to the entry itself, but also to the surrounding pages. Most names had dates separated by weeks or months. Eleanor's appeared repeatedly across several years. Every few pages, my father had written another brief update. Asterisk, no word yet. Asterisk. Asterisk, still searching. Asterisk. Asterisk, Daniel believes she is close. Asterisk. Asterisk, do not lose hope. Asterisk. My heartbeat slowed as the meaning gradually became clear. Eleanor hadn't disappeared. She had been searching for something, and my father had known it. More importantly, he had been quietly helping her. I leaned back and closed my eyes, trying to imagine the conversations that must have taken place all those years earlier. Eleanor arriving quietly at my parents' house after dark. My father opening the door without asking unnecessary questions. My mother preparing tea while pretending not to notice the fear on the visitor's face. They weren't hiding fugitives or criminals. They were protecting ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. The realization filled me with a profound sense of admiration. All my life, I had believed heroism required dramatic sacrifice. Instead, my parents had shown that sometimes heroism looked like keeping someone else's confidence for decades without expecting recognition. I carefully lifted the unopened envelope addressed to Eleanor. It remained perfectly sealed despite all the years that had passed. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the wax along the flap was completely intact. My father had never broken that seal. Neither would I. Whatever belonged to Eleanor still belonged to Eleanor, even if she had been gone for half a century. As I turned the envelope over my hands, however, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tucked beneath the wax seal was a second, much smaller piece of folded paper. It wasn't inside the envelope. It had been carefully slipped underneath the string holding the protective wrapping together, almost invisible unless someone examined it closely. I unfolded it carefully. Unlike every other message I had found, this note contained only an address. No explanation. No greeting. Just a farmhouse located nearly 80 miles from my hometown. Beneath the address appeared one final sentence written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. Asterisk, if this place is still standing, begin there. Asterisk. I stared at the address for several long moments. It meant only one thing. Daniel hadn't expected me merely to inherit my father's promises. He expected me to finish the last one. I left early the following morning, long before sunrise painted the sky above the fields. Sleep had become almost impossible anyway. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's handwriting, Daniel's careful instructions, and the unopened envelope resting safely inside the metal box. For the first time in my life, I understood that I wasn't chasing a mystery out of curiosity. I was trying to complete a promise that had remained unfinished for more than 50 years. Somehow, that responsibility no longer frightened me. It humbled me. Before leaving, I placed the envelope addressed to Eleanor inside a waterproof document case, along with my father's notebook, the photograph of him and Daniel, and both letters I had found inside the old coat. The brass key remained in my pocket, almost out of habit now. I no longer believed I would need it, but after everything that had happened, it felt wrong to leave it behind. Some objects become more than tools. They become companions on a journey. The drive took nearly 2 hours. The farther I traveled, the narrower the roads became. Modern neighborhoods slowly disappeared behind me, replaced by rolling farmland, aging barns, and long stretches of open countryside where telephone poles marched endlessly toward the horizon. Several times I questioned whether the address still existed. Daniel's note could easily have been written 15 or 20 years earlier. Farms change owners. Houses collapse. Roads are renamed. There was every possibility I was driving toward an empty field. Yet every mile brought an unexpected sense of familiarity. Not because I had been there before, because the landscape reminded me of childhood Sundays spent driving with my parents. My father always preferred quiet back roads over busy highways. He claimed you learned more about people by looking at the places they lived than by listening to the stories they told. At the time I had rolled my eyes, convinced he was simply avoiding traffic. Now I wondered how many of those scenic drives had actually been visits connected to the promises he had quietly carried. Eventually, the paved road ended. A gravel lane stretched ahead between rows of enormous oak trees whose branches intertwined overhead, forming a natural tunnel. The address matched exactly. My tires crunched slowly across the loose stones as I followed the lane deeper into the property. Then I saw the farmhouse. It was old, much older than I expected. White paint peeled gently from the wooden walls, ivy climbed one side of the chimney, and a wide porch wrapped around the front of the house. Time had certainly left its mark, but the place was far from abandoned. Flower boxes beneath the windows overflowed with late summer blooms. The grass had been freshly cut. Wind chimes swayed gently near the porch steps. Someone still lived there. I parked beside an aging pickup truck and remained inside the car for a moment, suddenly unsure how to begin. What exactly was I supposed to say? Hello, my father protected something for you 50 years ago. It sounded absurd, even impossible. Still, there was no other way. I climbed the porch steps and knocked softly on the weathered front door. Several seconds passed. Then I heard slow footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened. An elderly woman stood before me. She looked to be well into her 80s, perhaps even older. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and although age had bent her posture slightly, her blue eyes remained remarkably bright. They studied me with polite curiosity, the way someone in the countryside naturally evaluates an unexpected visitor before inviting them to speak. Can I help you? For a brief moment, words completely abandoned me. Then I quietly asked the only question that seemed possible. Did you ever know someone named Eleanor Whitmore? The color drained from her face. Her hand tightened around the edge of the door. For several long seconds, she didn't answer. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes as though searching for someone she hadn't seen in many decades. Finally, almost in a whisper, she asked, "Who are you?" I swallowed carefully. "My name is Margaret Bennett." The moment she heard my last name, tears immediately filled her eyes. She reached forward, taking both of my hands into hers with surprising strength. "I've waited." Her voice broke completely. More than 50 years to hear that name again. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The elderly woman continued holding my hands as tears quietly rolled down her cheeks. Her reaction wasn't the polite emotion of someone remembering an old acquaintance. It was something much deeper. It was relief. The kind of relief a person feels only after carrying hope for so many years that they eventually stop believing it will ever be rewarded. "Please," she whispered, gently stepping aside. "Come inside." The farmhouse smelled of fresh bread, lavender, and old wood. Everything inside was spotless despite its age. Family photographs covered nearly every wall, shelves overflowed with books, and a large stone fireplace dominated the living room. Nothing suggested wealth or luxury. Instead, The house radiated the peaceful warmth that only decades of careful living can create. She motioned toward a small table beside the window. "I'll make some tea." I almost told her it wasn't necessary, but something stopped me. My mother had always prepared tea before discussing difficult subjects. Somehow, allowing this woman to do the same felt strangely appropriate. Several minutes later, she returned carrying 2 delicate porcelain cups. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed one before me. "You said your name is Margaret Bennett." "Yes." She closed her eyes. I never thought I'd live long enough to meet Thomas's daughter. My father's name sounded completely natural when she spoke it, not like a distant memory, like someone she had known personally. "You knew my father?" She smiled softly. "He saved my life." The room became perfectly still. Not figuratively, perfectly still. Even the ticking clock on the mantel suddenly seemed louder. "I don't understand." "I know." She wrapped both hands around her teacup before continuing. "My name isn't Eleanor." I frowned. It never was. The sentence took several moments to register. The woman in the newspaper had to disappear. She nodded. Eleanor Whitmore died only on paper. 1,000 questions flooded my mind at once. Seeing the confusion on my face, she gave a patient smile remarkably similar to my mother's. "Thomas told me one day someone would come asking about Eleanor. He said if that happened, I should finally tell the truth." She stood slowly and walked toward an old wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. From the bottom drawer, she removed a small photograph album. Carefully opening the first page, she turned it toward me. The young schoolteacher from the newspaper smiled back at me. The exact same woman. Only now, she was standing beside a much younger version of the elderly lady sitting across from me. "They're both me." I stared at the photographs in disbelief. "After everything that happened," she continued quietly, "Thomas helped me become someone else." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" She took a slow breath. "There was a man who refused to accept that our marriage was over. Every court order, every police report, every legal document only made him angrier. One night he told me that if he couldn't control me, nobody ever would." My stomach tightened. She didn't need to explain further. The fear in her eyes finished the story. I ran. She looked toward the window where sunlight illuminated the old porch. "I changed towns. I changed my name. I changed my entire life. But he kept finding me." I felt my throat tighten. "My father helped you disappear." She nodded. "Not disappear." She smiled sadly. "He helped me survive." Silence filled the room again. "Finally," she continued, "back then, women like me didn't have many places to go. Shelters were rare. Laws were weaker. People often told us to forgive, to go home, to try again. Thomas never said any of those things." "What did he say?" She smiled through fresh tears. "He looked at me and said."
She paused.
"Everyone deserves one place where fear cannot follow them." I lowered my eyes. That sentence sounded exactly like my father. Simple, gentle, profound. She continued speaking. "He kept my birth certificate, my property records, my school certificates, my savings documents. If anyone came looking, he simply said he'd never heard of Eleanor Whitmore." I suddenly understood everything. The envelope, the notebook, the metal box, the promises. None of it had been about hiding the truth. It had been about protecting people until they were finally safe enough to own their truth again. The elderly woman slowly reached across the table and took my hand once more. "I've lived under another name for 53 years. She looked directly into my eyes. "And today," her voice trembled, "your father finally kept the last promise he ever made." Neither of us spoke for a long while after that. The room remained wrapped in a peaceful silence, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fireplace and the soft ticking of an old clock somewhere deeper inside the house. I looked at the woman sitting across from me and found it almost impossible to imagine the frightened schoolteacher from the faded newspaper clipping. 53 years had transformed her appearance completely, but not her eyes. There was still a quiet alertness in them, the kind that belongs to someone who spent too many years expecting danger to appear without warning. Slowly, I reached into my leather document case and removed the sealed envelope. The moment she saw my father's handwriting across the front, her hands flew to her mouth. She didn't touch it. She simply stared. "I never thought," she whispered. "I never thought it still existed." "It does." Her eyes filled with tears. "I protected it exactly the way my father protected it." She closed her eyes. "And your mother?" I nodded. "My mother protected it after he died." The elderly woman lowered her head. "I used to wonder about her every Christmas." I looked at her in surprise. "You knew my mother?" "Only a little." She smiled softly. "She always insisted on making tea whenever I visited. She hardly spoke about what was happening. She never asked unnecessary questions. But before I left each time, she hugged me." The woman's voice became almost inaudible. I think she understood that sometimes people don't need advice. They only need someone who doesn't judge them. I smiled. That sounds exactly like her. She laughed gently through her tears. "It does." I carefully placed the envelope on the table between us. For several long moments, neither of us moved. Finally, she looked at me. "May I?" "It's yours." Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. She turned it over slowly, running her fingertips across the yellowed paper exactly as I had done with my mother's letter only days before. Time seemed to disappear as she carefully broke the old wax seal that had remained untouched for more than half a century. She unfolded the contents. Several official documents slid gently onto the table. A birth certificate, property deeds, teaching credentials, a small savings certificate from an old local bank. Everything she had believed lost forever. She covered her face with both hands and began crying quietly. Not the desperate crying of grief, the peaceful crying that arrives when an old wound finally stops hurting. When she finally looked up again, she held one last folded page separate from the others. "It isn't mine," she whispered. "What do you mean?" She handed it to me. The handwriting. I unfolded it carefully. It was from my father. Unlike every other note I had found, this one wasn't written to me. It was addressed to Eleanor. Asterisk, if you're reading this, then the world finally became kind enough for you to stop hiding. Asterisk. I swallowed hard and continued. Asterisk, if that day comes, promise me one thing. Don't spend the rest of your life remembering the years that were stolen from you. Remember the years you managed to build afterward. Evil always wants to convince us it defines our story. Don't allow it that victory. Asterisk. I paused. The elderly woman was quietly crying again. I continued reading. Asterisk. One day my daughter may be the person who returns this envelope. If that happens, please tell her something I may never have the chance to say. Asterisk. My heart began pounding. Asterisk. Tell Margaret that keeping promises is important, but understanding why we keep them is even more important. Asterisk. The room fell completely silent. For 70 years I had admired my father because I believed he was an honest man. Now I understood something much greater. He had never kept promises because he enjoyed carrying burdens. He kept them because every promise represented another human being who deserved dignity, safety, and hope. The elderly woman slowly reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. Your father gave me a second life. She smiled through tears. And today, she looked at the documents spread across the table. His daughter gave me back my first one. I remained at the farmhouse until the sun began disappearing behind the distant hills. Neither of us felt any urgency to end the conversation. After more than 50 years of waiting, there was no reason to rush the final chapter. Eleanor, if I can still call her that, shared stories about the quiet life she had built under her new identity. She had become a teacher again in another county, married a gentle widower many years later, helped raise his children, and eventually watched grandchildren fill the very farmhouse where we now sat. Listening to her, I realized my father had been right. The years stolen from her no longer defined her life. They had become only the first chapter of a much longer story. Before I left, She disappeared briefly into another room and returned carrying a small wooden box no larger than a jewelry case. The finish had faded with age, but it had clearly been cared for with great affection. "I've been saving this for a very long time." She placed it gently into my hands. "What is it?" "I don't know." I looked up in surprise. "You never opened it?" She smiled softly. "Thomas asked me not to." I couldn't help laughing quietly. "It seems my father asked everyone to keep promises." "He did. And somehow—" She looked warmly into my eyes. "Everyone wanted to keep them." I thanked her, hugged her tightly, and promised to visit again soon, not because of unfinished mysteries, but because neither of us wanted this unexpected friendship to end. As I walked toward my car, she called my name one last time. "Margaret." I turned. "You look exactly like your mother when you smile." Those words stayed with me during the entire drive home. Night had already fallen by the time I reached my house. The familiar hallway welcomed me with quiet stillness, and almost instinctively my eyes drifted toward the old brown coat still hanging inside the closet. For the first time since discovering its secret compartment, I no longer saw an old piece of clothing. I saw my parents, their patience, their kindness, their courage. Closing the closet door gently, I carried the small wooden box into the living room and placed it beside the fireplace. Unlike everything else, this box carried no labels, no names, no instructions. Only a tiny brass clasp held the lid shut. For several minutes I debated whether opening it would somehow violate yet another promise. Then I remembered Eleanor's words. Thomas asked me not to. Not forever. Simply until the right time. Perhaps this was finally that time. I lifted the clasp. Inside rested only two objects: a faded blue ribbon and a sealed envelope. The ribbon puzzled me at first. It looked completely ordinary until I turned it over and recognized the delicate stitching along one edge. My mother had embroidered it by hand. I remembered watching her sew ribbons exactly like that when I was a little girl. Beneath it lay the envelope. Across the front appeared my mother's handwriting. "For Thomas, if I am gone first." I felt my breath catch. This wasn't meant for me. It was the only letter I had found that neither parent expected me to read. It belonged to my father, yet he never received it. Carefully, I unfolded the paper. The first line immediately filled my eyes with tears. "My dearest Thomas, if Margaret is reading this instead of you, then we both know life chose a different ending than either of us wanted." I stopped. For the first time in days. I wasn't reading instructions, or clues, or promises. I was reading a love letter, one quietly hidden away by the woman who had spent her entire life making sure everyone else's story survived. I held the letter for several moments before continuing. Somehow, after everything I had discovered over the past few days, this frightened me more than the hidden compartment inside the station or the sealed envelope that had finally reached Eleanor. Those discoveries had revealed secrets. This one revealed something far more intimate. It revealed two people who had loved each other so deeply that even their private words had been carefully protected for more than half a century. My mother's handwriting remained as graceful as ever, every sentence flowing neatly across the page. Thomas, you always worry that one day you won't be able to finish what you've started. You believe promises are measured by whether we live long enough to keep them ourselves. I disagree. A promise is measured by whether the kindness behind it continues after we're gone. I paused, wiping a tear before continuing. You once told me that you were afraid Margaret would someday inherit burdens she never asked for. I don't think you give our daughter enough credit. She has your heart. She only doesn't know it yet. I laughed softly through my tears. All my life, I had believed I resembled my mother more than my father. Perhaps I had been wrong. The letter continued. If I leave this world before you do, I want you to promise me something. Don't spend your remaining years wondering whether you did enough for the people who trusted you. You already have. No one who came to our door ever left feeling alone. That is more valuable than any fortune we could have given them. I lowered the paper again. The simplicity of those words struck me harder than anything else I had read. No one who came to our door ever left feeling alone. I suddenly remembered all the evenings during my childhood when unfamiliar visitors quietly sat at our kitchen table drinking tea with my parents. As a little girl, I assumed they were distant relatives or old family friends. My mother would smile, ask me to finish my homework upstairs, and gently close the kitchen door. Now I understood. Those visitors weren't guests. They were people carrying fear. And my parents had offered them something most of the world couldn't.
Safety.
I continued reading. Asterisk, if neither of us is here when Margaret finally understands everything, I hope she never mistakes secrecy for dishonesty. We kept silent because truth can only heal people when it arrives at the right moment. Before then, it often becomes another burden. Asterisk. I closed my eyes. How many times had I judged my parents for saying too little? How many times had I assumed they simply belonged to a generation that struggled to express emotions? In reality, they had spent their lives carefully deciding which truths belonged to them and which belonged to someone else. The final page contained only a few short paragraphs. Asterisk, please keep wearing your old brown coat. You always complain that it's too heavy, but I secretly love seeing you in it. Every winter, when you leave the house wearing that ridiculous old coat, I know you'll come home again. Asterisk. A smile spread across my face. The famous coat. The object that had begun this entire journey. To my mother, it had never simply been a hiding place. It had also been a reminder of the man she loved. The final lines were almost unbearably beautiful. Asterisk. If our daughter ever discovers this letter, tell her something for me, since I won't be there to say it myself. Asterisk. I took a slow breath. Margaret. Seeing my own name written by my mother one last time felt almost like hearing her voice. Asterisk, don't remember us because we kept extraordinary secrets. Asterisk. I swallowed hard. Asterisk, remember us because we tried to do ordinary kindness every single day. Asterisk. The letter ended there. No dramatic farewell. No final instructions. Only her signature. With all my love, always. Elizabeth. I folded the pages carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. Then I looked toward the hallway where the old brown coat still hung quietly in the closet. For decades, I had believed that coat contained my parents' greatest secret. Now I understood. The coat had never been the secret. It had simply been the place where two ordinary people protected hope until the world became safe enough to receive it. Several weeks passed before life began to resemble normal again. The discoveries had ended, the letters had all been read, and the promises my parents carried for so many decades had finally reached the people they were meant to protect. Yet something inside me had changed forever. I found myself looking at ordinary moments differently. Every stranger at the grocery store, every elderly neighbor walking slowly to the mailbox, every quiet conversation over a cup of coffee reminded me that we never truly know what burdens another person has survived. One afternoon, while organizing the study where my father used to spend so many evenings writing in silence, I opened the large oak desk one final time. It no longer felt like searching for secrets. It felt like saying goodbye. Most of the drawers contained exactly what I expected. Old receipts, worn pencils, faded family photographs, church bulletins, birthday cards, and dozens of small objects that had accumulated over an ordinary lifetime. Looking through them, I smiled more often than I cried. My parents had lived remarkable lives, yet the evidence they left behind was beautifully ordinary. At the very back of the lowest drawer, however, I found one empty leather notebook. Unlike my father's notebooks, every page was blank. Not a single word had ever been written inside. I turned it over in my hands, wondering why he had kept it. Then I noticed something tucked inside the front cover. A tiny handwritten label. Only 6 words. For whoever keeps the next promise. I laughed quietly. Even after everything, my father still managed to surprise me. He hadn't left me another mystery. He had left me a choice. For several minutes I sat at his old desk, holding the blank notebook while sunlight drifted slowly across the room. I thought about every person whose life had crossed my parents' path. None of them had become famous. None had appeared in history books. Yet because two ordinary people had quietly chosen compassion instead of indifference, entire families had survived, children had grown up safely, and future generations had lived peaceful lives without ever knowing whose kindness had made it possible. That realization changed something fundamental inside me. Legacy isn't measured by the number of people who remember your name. It's measured by the number of lives that become gentler because you existed. I uncapped one of my father's old fountain pens. The ink still worked. For a long moment, I stared at the first empty page. Then I wrote only one sentence. Asterisk. Today I finally understand why my parents never asked to be remembered. Asterisk. I stopped again. Below it I added another. Asterisk. Kindness is strongest when it expects nothing in return. Asterisk. Closing the notebook, I realized I wasn't continuing my father's work exactly as he had done it. The world had changed. People now had different resources, different laws, different ways of helping one another. But compassion would never become outdated. There would always be someone who needed a safe conversation, a quiet act of generosity, or simply another human being willing to listen without judgment. A month later, I visited Eleanor again. She greeted me with the same warm smile she had worn the first day I knocked on her door. We spent the afternoon drinking tea, laughing over stories about my parents, and remembering people neither of us would ever forget. Before leaving, I showed her the blank notebook. She carefully read the first page. Then she smiled. Thomas would approve. I shook my head gently.
No.
She looked at me curiously. My father would probably tell me to stop worrying about whether he'd approve and simply keep doing what is right. She laughed. You're becoming more like him every day. As I drove home that evening, the setting sun painted the countryside in warm shades of gold, just as it had on countless drives with my parents years before. For the first time since my mother's funeral, I no longer felt as though I had lost them. I carried them with me, not in hidden compartments, not in sealed envelopes, not inside an old brown coat, but in every quiet decision to choose kindness when no one else was watching. And somehow, I finally understood. That had been the greatest inheritance they ever left me.